Amazing. And now, actually, I'm going to screenshot this hopefully before the number changes. Robert, we just hit 12,000 people watching live.
Sweet. That's fantastic.
It's phenomenal.
Hey,
okay.
Thanks to everybody. Send a thank you card to the Southern District of New York.
The Streisand effect in full force. If anybody doesn't know the origins of the Streisand effect, go to my Twitter feed because I just posted it. It's amazing. Long story short, Barbara Streisand sued an aerial photographer for having published an aerial photo of her Malibu residence. And before she sued, it had been downloaded 8 times, 2 of which were by her own attorneys. After she sued, it was downloaded over 420,000 times. So strictly as a result of the suit. So this is it, spreading more knowledge. One more, then we're going to go into the Hatch Act because we need to get the Hatch Act out of the way to get to Kyle because that's what everybody wants to know about. Yeah. Little Rock says, you have grown so much since I started watching your live streams. That demonstrates how great you are. You too are with your podcasts. Thank you for this free speech answer. Always lean toward freedom of speech. I don't read too well, too quickly. Okay, 52 minutes in. The Hatch Act, Robert. The word going around is that as a result of the RNC speeches that were given, there were a slew of Hatch Act violations. Everybody needs to be locked up. Elaborate. First of all, explain. I've watched several videos on what the Hatch Act is. I think I understand the history. I think I understand the purpose, but you will do better summarizing it than me. Inform the people who don't know.
Sure. So the Hatch Act was part of removing political machines from the federal government. Now, I've not been a fan of that. I think political machines actually empowered working class communities and held governments more responsible than it does now. You know, if you knew you could get thrown out if your guy lost, you tended to provide government services a lot better. If you knew it doesn't matter at all and I can do whatever I want, you tend to not provide government services so sensitive to your constituents. So, but putting that political point aside, the political machines were a powerful tool from the 1860s to the 1940s, in which basically the spoil system, you would hire someone, whoever won got the spoils, and that meant a lot of jobs. The post office, interestingly enough, used to be the main spoil system for the federal government. So if your side won, you got appointed a postal carrier. So if the Democrats won, it was all Democratic postal carriers, and all Republicans won, all Republicans, and so forth. And that began to change at the turn of the century. The so-called progressive movement wanted to take out political machines in the name of getting rid of corruption, saying we wanted honest government servants who had no political obligation to either party. The net effect of it was actually to make them less responsive to the public than more. But putting that aside, part of that was in the 1920s and 30s, you could have people using the power of a federal government employment to have them use that federal government employment to propagate political causes. So imagine if you could call up the local postal carriers in, say, Chicago and say, hey, I want you to go organize the vote in the South Side today. Make sure we get all the Democrats out. Make sure you know who they are. Knock on their door. Bring them there. In order to preclude that from happening, the Hatch Act was passed, which meant it was, again, just to remove the power of a political machine from federal employment. It was not to ban people's political activities simply because they happen to have government employment. So that's always been the line. The Supreme Court has sort of gone back and forth on where to push that line. I personally agree with Justice Douglas and others that the Hatch Act actually goes too far at limiting people's First Amendment freedoms. But putting that aside, the net effect of it is once you understand its policy purpose, you understand why it wouldn't apply to a bunch of political appointees except in rare circumstance. So to White House employees and people like that. This was meant to preclude using the power of government to create a political machine through the tool of federal employment. It was not meant to silence and suppress everybody's political speech merely because they have to be getting a government paycheck. The latter is how it has been selectively interpreted and constructed. So that's the broad understanding of Hatch Act. Does it really go to the purpose and principle of it? Is it really somebody using federal employment to obtain a political machine? If not, then it's really probably not applicable. It might be technically applicable, but outside what the purpose and principle of the law is in its first intention. And the remedies for it are kind of limited. Usually you just get a sort of slap on the wrist. And sometimes you can be removed from your employment, but it's not a crime in most instances. And the Hatch Act has been an misused and abused provision. In my view, but even applying it under its broadest terms and ignoring its historical purpose and premise, there are plenty of reasons why the Hatch Act would not apply to the South Lawn presentation. The Hatch Act, of course, does not apply to the president himself. That's right out of the gate.
Yeah, two things. So a lot of people are excluded, which I think most people don't appreciate. I think president, vice president, secretary of state.
Yeah. And yes. And in fact, really, again, go back to the idea of, are you using federal employment to advance your political purposes, or are these historically political appointees? If they're historically political appointees, that isn't who they were trying to deal with in the Hatch Act. And sometimes they get sucked up into the broad language of the Hatch Act, but that isn't what the original purpose of that was. So political appointees, like pretty much everybody, frankly, works at the White House. Like, here would be the thing. You can't make the janitor from the White House go up and say, "Go Trump." Right? That would be kind of misuse of federal employment power to leverage somebody who's not a political appointee to advance your political cause. You can't have the Secret Service go out and organize the vote, right? Show up in their SUV and saying, "You're going to vote today, pal." That's what they're aiming at. They're not aiming at the political appointees getting together and talking about why they were appointed in the first place and asking for re-election. There's also an issue that the southern lawn of the White House, there's a strong argument that it is part of his personal residence, and as such is not a federal building for Hatch Act purposes anyway.
Okay, so actually, let's stop it there. And actually, one stop before we get there. Telling the janitor, "Go support the president or you're fired," would be a Hatch Act violation.
Yes,
I would imagine the a postal service slipping in "Vote for X" because that's who they want personally would be a Hatch Act violation because they're abusing of their position to promote a political end.
Yes.
Fundraising while saying "I work for the government," fundraise for this particular candidate would be a violation. Sorry, something I don't even know what fell down. So those are the types. Now it also is dependent on where you are. It has to be during your employment within a federal building, from what I understand.
And again, the best way to understand is what all these rules are intended to get at is someone leveraging the power of federal employment for politicized purposes to create the equivalent of a political machine. So are they leveraging federal employment, or do they just happen to be a federal employee who's doing something? And that's the key kind of distinction in my view. Sometimes the courts are consistent about interpreting that way, sometimes not. But that's the broader purpose. So are you using federal employment to do something you could not otherwise do? Right. So if the postal person knocks on your door and says, "You better vote Democrat," while in their postal uniform, then they couldn't do that but for the fact that they have the postal position. If they're doing something in their spare time that doesn't leverage their postal position that they could do regardless of their postal position, then they're not really leveraging federal employment for politicized purposes. And that's the way to think of it. And that's why, generally speaking, it doesn't apply to a lot of White House activities. And I think even now, I think it was misapplied to Kellyanne Conway. It's not meant for that. The Hatch Act is not meant to be this technical loophole that prevents people from exercising free speech rights and effective political advocacy because they happen to get a government paycheck. It's meant for not leveraging federal paychecks and federal employment to obtain an unfair political advantage or edge. Most of what the media was complaining about was, golly gee, Trump is an incumbent. An incumbent gets to do things like fly in Air Force One and walk around the White House. But next time, don't ban him from having his convention in North Carolina, dear Democratic governor. If you don't want him using that's where he got the inspired idea. It was like, okay, I can't go down there. And he's like, yeah, I'm in the White House, aren't I? Don't give Trump good ideas if you don't want him to use those good ideas.
So I had a tweet exchange with someone where they said, okay, it's because they gave the explanation. They're federal employees giving speeches at an RNC, clear Hatch Act violation. Setting aside whether or not they're in a federal building, what I asked, and I don't know if it's a stupid question for another reason, but Nancy Pelosi at the podium the other day saying why Joe Biden shouldn't debate with President Trump. I don't consider that a Hatch Act violation. But am I wrong for not?
No, it's not, because it's all about weaponizing federal employment, particularly for non-political appointees. Frankly, I mean that's who they're targeting. They what they don't want people to do is to basically hire people to advance their political cause using federal employment power to do so. They wanted to make sure the spoils system would no longer existed. And once you understand that, you understand how any other application of it, like they're talking about, is a misapplication of it. And there's technical readings and interpretations that can kind of go there, but that's inconsistent with the purpose and premise. And at some point, it starts to violate people's First Amendment rights. I mean, Justice Douglas didn't like the statute, period. He said the statute could easily be interpreted in a way that violated First Amendment rights, so the whole thing should be struck down. I think he was right. And again, I'm an absolutist and a purist when it comes to the First Amendment, so that I always lean that way. But even allowing some degree of, I understand not allowing your political opponent to have the access to the federal treasury as a campaign donation. That's the goal. Not everything you ever do inside the federal, as part of your job or using federal resources at any level can now magically be apolitical, and that's not realistic in the first place anyway. It's to make sure your postal carrier is not being political. It's not worried about the president or Congress members being political.
And people have been prosecuted under the Hatch Act in the past?
No, I mean, what happens is it goes to the Ethics Council and they write real aggressive letters. They say bad. That's about all. It's kind of a joke of a law. It's mostly meant there if somebody if it was a true abuse. If a letter carrier, say, for example, decided I'm not going to deliver absentee ballots to Republicans or Democrats this year, right? That would end up getting prosecuted. But these kind of things, it's just the remedies are limited for good cause because they don't want this to get excessive. They just don't. They want to preclude leveraging federal machinery for politicized purposes without infringing on First Amendment expectations or protection.
Okay, amazing. Actually sounds somewhat like our Conflict of Interest Act, which has it has provisions that have no sanctions. And so when your prime minister is in his third violation of ethics, there's not even a slap on the wrist. I think people are just fatigued of the inquiries at this point.
Yes.
Okay, good time. We're going to move on to the Kyle Rittenhouse now, and I'm going to try to bring up some. I can't bring these super chats up, but I'm going to. I missed one from Larry Anthony. No, Larry Anthony I brought up. Thank you very much. Good to see you again, Larry. Scuba Steve says, "You guys are like the Siskel and Ebert of law. I like it. Keep up the great work. I haven't thought about it, but I can see it now."